First of all, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm gonna this presentation is based on the research that has been concluded at the end of 2014, and the paper has been written over the last 2 weeks, so it's very draft paper. So comments are very welcome and your reflections on it. The aim of the paper is to contribute to an understanding of social protection within the context of cross-border employment and the changing employment landscape. An employment landscape which is related to an economy that is, to a model of growth that is more and more based on outsourcing. So how am I going to do this? Theoretically, I'm going to combine. Theoretically, my paper will highlight the contradiction. Will combine international social protection, these perspectives, and labor market segmentation analysis. We'll do so empirically by discussing the labor demand and supply conditions of the agency employment landscape under which migrant temporary workers strive to accrue resources and distribute resources. So I'm going to try and be brief on the theory slide, because it's quite long, as you will see. Theoretically, my paper aims to highlight the contradiction between the ideal supranational social citizenship and the reality of, as I say here, the restrictive national social citizenship. Adrian was talking before about the default national social citizenship that comes into place. That's what I mean. And I will also be talking about the concept of transnational social protection. I will explain it as we go on, to save some time. And my paper will seek to explore how the changing employment landscape affects social protection, and in particular, is labor market segmentation restricting the agency workers' opportunities to move on, or is it opening up new opportunities? Starting with the issue of labor market segmentation, some theorists have been optimistic about it, and I mentioned here the work of Scott and the transaction costs approach. Very briefly, he says that the search for flexibility in production runs in parallel with the flexibility in labor markets, and a result of that is labor market segmentation. But he believes as the web of inter-organizational transactions between firms in a locality thickens, he argues that the negative effects of labor supply segmentations are mitigated somehow. Then people have mentioned before about the varieties of capitalism theory. They have proposed two opposing perspectives on this inter-organizational transaction between firms in post-industrial capitalism. They talked about the liberal market economies and the coordinated market economies. However, evidence in life has proved them wrong. For example, Germany has been cited as the typical coordinated market economy, where firms are investing in their workforce, and there is less fierce interfering competition, less poaching of labor, more internal labor markets. Whereas the evidence that we see today, even in construction, even in the manufacturing sector in Germany, we see that a growing segment of the workforce is temporary workforce. But I'm rambling on here about these things. There are other studies that have been. The other problem with the VOC theory is that they had limited focus on labor supply structuration processes. But there have been other studies who have brought nuanced accounts of labor supply segmentation. But when it came to explaining the causality of labor supply segmentation, they just blame the employers and without showing the social context in which employers function. Finally, there is the work of Jamie Peck and others who brought in multi-causal explanations of labor market segmentation, and they brought the demand and the supply conditions together. And the problem with that is that the transnational and the informal aspects of the way labor supply is segmented is missing. Thomas Feist comes in and introduces the concept of transnational social protection, saying that, especially with migrants, we have people accrue resources and distribute resources, and the flow of resources goes back and forth between countries, and the migrants who live in the UK, they rely on family abroad, on family in the origin country. Let's talk about remittances, reverse remittances, etc. And so what do I do in this paper? What I attempt to do is to bring to factor the demand-side conditions which structure this change in employment landscape in an analysis of how workers accrue and distribute resources for their welfare. Why do I focus on temporary agency work? Is because so far studies on social protection, they either do not distinguish between direct and agency-mediated forms of employment, or just focus on the former. So this is one of the reasons. I do the study I'm going to present, the study findings I'm going to be presenting in the next slide are on 10 minutes, are on two sectors, and the sectors are the hospitality sector and the food industry. And the reason I chose them is because they have a certain mix of an interesting mix of variable product and labor supply chains, both sectors, and they have an interesting mix of internal versus external labor market regulatory regimes. So coming to the empirical findings, I haven't told you, it's in the last slide, I'm trying to speed up. The interviews I made were in-depth qualitative interviews. In the last slide I can show you the samples and etc. The interviews were taken in different localities in England. So what is the context in which temporary labor becomes available in certain forms and prices? First, one of the factors that we need to consider is that we have an booming international recruitment industry. My research has pointed out numerous cases of agencies, especially foreign agencies, charging illegal brokerage fees to workers to come and work in the UK. I can talk to you in detail about this, but of course, if you were a European national, you paid a certain amount. If you were a third country national, you paid double or more than that. Romanians and Bulgarians have been affected by this during the labour market restrictions between 2007 and 2013. In order to deal with all that, there have been regulatory approaches. The Gangmaster Licensing Authority is one organization, is one policy initiative that has been cited as a good example. in literature. In the UK, we have, however, and the food industry is subject to inspections by the GLA. The labour inspector, however, this country has no labour inspectorate, so other sectors like hospitality sector is subject to other forms of regulation. I'll briefly tell you about this in a short while. So there have been other forms of regulation. Some people before talked about the Posted Workers Directive. My research shows that, along with other research like Jan Kremers has produced a lot of work on that, is that we show that sometimes it's not businesses that operate in different countries, but sometimes you have agencies who advertise themselves as bogus businesses, and they post workers, agency workers, to work in British farms. There's a lot to say. 10 minutes, okay, or maybe less. So one of the major regulative frameworks is the agency worker regulations that came in force in 2011 in the UK. One of the hopes from these regulations was, whether to give people the opportunity to move out of insecure and precarious work and be in a better position to accrue and distribute resources for the reproduction of the household. However, I found in different case studies that I made in my research that there are businesses they have developed practices to avoid responsibilities towards workers. These are formal means of evasion, of circumventing responsibilities, and informal ones. Part of the formal ones are the how many minutes do I have? 5? Part of the formal ones are in food industry companies who are subject to the GLA inspections and who happen to be in a supply chain that is close to large retailers who contributed in developing the GLA. We have formal means of circumventing responsibilities towards workers. I mentioned 2 examples: Swedish derogation contracts. I can explain to you later if you want about this. Basically, what it means is that agencies can take people on contracts if people are employed for more than 12 weeks in a certain end user employer. Agencies are obliged to take them on contracts, or they would have to pay them equal amounts to permanent workers. The SD contract agency workers are paid less than the permanent workers, but they would be paid between assignments if there was no work. Other ways are the misuse of performance target systems on shop floors of food packing firms, for instance, Morrison's, Sainsbury's, etc., where people are allocated a certain pick rate and target, and if people fall below that, but there are ways that managers misuse that and make people think that they didn't do the job properly, so they're dismissed before the 12 weeks, so they're not allowed to any agency contract. People are moved from temporary to temporary assignments, basically. There are other formal patterns of circumvention in industries like in industries where the regulation comes only from internal labor markets. I mentioned here in the hospitality sector hotels, international, which are subject to franchise standards, and they have to produce, and there's kind of an internal labor market regulating our activities. But there have been ways where these are circumvented, that these responsibilities to the workers are circumvented, and I can explain to you later about this. And there, of course, there are informal labor arrangements in high street hospitality businesses, which have no hard internal franchise standards to meet, but only soft, externally enforceable labor law standards by non-existing labor inspectorate. So all of this situation comes, the impacts of all the situation on workers is that throughout the history, the life stories of people I collected, I found that there is people are shifting from a temporary to a temporary assignment for years. There is an ability to plan family life. There is people are becoming forced part-timers, and yeah, the situation is troublesome. To say a few things. And then, however, it's not just the above labour market regulatory regime that produces pools of precarious workers, but also migration policy, as I mentioned briefly, about the labour market restrictions, and it is also the restrictive workfare regime. I'll just mention the fact that, linking to the previous presentation, what I found in my fieldwork is that mainly people, they did not claim benefits, but some people, they claimed, some agency workers, they had to claim in-work benefits like working tax credit in order to survive during the first 5 months of their residence in the UK, and they could not have survived without that. People are also so limiting that, or limiting free movement, will create, as I say here, bottlenecks for the transnational flows of resources between host and origin countries. Also, people can manage to reproduce their household needs by having support from their families back home. For instance, there have been many cases where young women, like the previous one of the biographies that just talked about, young women who had young kids and could not support them at all due to the conditions of their work, and they had to send their kids back home and be separated. But they could do it only because they had support from back home. So there are various problems that will arise. Also, people are coming in order to make some savings and send some money back home. But this will not be possible if people are, if people live in such insecure circumstances. The strategies that are, one of the findings that I had is that many people who wanted to move out of working farms in agriculture, the arduous workplaces, they wanted to move to cities. People who have been talking before about lifestyle migration, but what have they moved to is in job insecurity, basically. Working as chefs, working in care homes, working in hospitality, etc., or packing firms, food packing, etc. The networks that one of my field trips was in northeast England, in small towns around Bradford and Leeds, and I interviewed Pakistani agency workers there. The only way they could manage to survive was through family support they were married to a British Pakistani girl who had a permanent job, and that's the only way they could survive. The other way, Eastern and Southern Europeans, in my sample, some of them escaped very abusive work arrangements because they entered into a relationship, and because they had, as I said, support from relatives back home. So, to finish, my research has shown practices reinforcing a precarious labour market regime, and if we combine that with an uncertain immigration regime, and not least restrictive immigration regime, and workfairism in this country, my research suggests that there is precarious, that this produces a precarious form of social protection. And the question that I tried to answer in my paper was, how far can we go with informal transnational social protection? Does it lead to other forms of inequalities in the meantime, and new forms of exploitation and abuse? I'll stop now. Thank you.